Hello everybody and welcome to our first lesson for the British Empire for AQA A-Level History. In this video what we're going to do is take an introduction to the British Empire from around circa 1857, and we're going to talk about the development of imperialism from this period. Now this is a series of lessons covering the AQA specification on the British Empire between 1857 and 1967. This is the specification, so it is divided broadly into 4 specific chapters. The first of these chapters is the development of imperialism circa 1857 to circa 1890, the sort of latter half of the 1800s. Where in this first set of lessons, we're going to talk about the expansion of the British Empire in Africa. We're going to talk about the development of the swing to the east, as it is described, the motivations for the swing to the east, as well as the relationship between the British Empire and Egypt, and the establishment of the Suez Company and the creation of the Suez Canal. Throughout this series of videos, we're going to talk about the various different elements of imperial and colonial policy in relation to the British Empire's administration of India, for example, as well as its administration of other parts of the imperial world, Africa and the Middle East, for example, as well. We'll talk about the role and influence of attitudes towards the empire, the various different people who perceive and understand the British Empire during this period, as well as the relationship between the British Empire and her subjects with indigenous peoples to which they are imperialistic towards. Like I said, it's broadly defined into 4 distinct chapters. The first chapter is the development of imperialism from 1857 to 1890. There is also the second chapter, which is imperial consolidation and liberal rule. This takes us from the 1890s all the way to the beginning of the First World War in 1914. We will then start to talk about the challenges to the British Empire and imperialism between 1914 and 1947. This takes us from the beginning of the First World War to the end of the Second World War and the end of the mandate periods post World War II as well. We will then talk about the period of decolonization that takes place between 1947 and 1967, where we see a contraction of the British Empire and the so-called, quote, winds of change that exists with the establishment of independence across all of these territories. This lesson specifically will be taking an introduction to the British Empire at the midpoint of the 1800s, circa 1857, and we will look at the motives for expansion of the British Empire in Africa. So let's think about this. One of the things that happens, and one of the things that is a fact of the British Empire, is that between the sort of 1857 to 1890 period, we will see a major shift in the British Empire away from the looking towards the Americas to instead looking towards Africa, and we will see extensive expansion of the British Empire in and across the continent of Africa. Now, one of the things that is hotly debated in this regard are the motivations for this expansion. Why is it the case that the British Empire significantly swings to the east and looks to Africa and in some cases the Middle East and Asia in terms of expanding its territory? Well, some historians argue that expansion of the British Empire to the continent of Africa was primarily for economic reasons. There was seemingly a need to seek out new resources and expand into these new regions to find said resources. One of the things that imperialism always brings with it is the view that there needs to be a consistent and constant expansion to acquire and to extract new resources. This is seen as one of the major motivations and the major economic motivation for a shift in the perspective of the British Empire to Africa. So we describe the expansion of the British Empire into Africa as the so-called swing to the east. The reason why we call it the swing to the east is because historically the British Empire, while having ties and connections and influences in places like the Middle East and in places like Asia, was historically more focused and geared towards the New World, the establishment of colonies and colonization in the Americas. And so as a result of this, when we see a shift in the perspective away from the Americas to Africa, this is what we describe as a swing to the east. Now, one interesting factor that we can use to explain why there was an expansion of the empire into Africa was because of the loss of the American colonies following the breaking out of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. So this is significantly prior to what we are describing in this series of lessons. But the Revolutionary War broke out for a number of different reasons. But prior to the sort of 1770s, the Americas were colonies that were owned by the British Empire. And so the British had a significant stake and a significant interest in the Americas. When the war breaks out and the American colonies declare independence, and you have the new United States of America, following the Revolutionary War as well, the British tried to keep the Americas and the colonies, but they failed. You find that there is no longer this ability for the British to actually hold on to and expand into these territories, so they would swing to the east. One of the reasons for the Revolutionary War breaking out was the fact that, of course, there was a desire on the part of colonists to have representation in Parliament. Famously, they were taxed without representation in the colonies, and this sparked the famous phrase, "no taxation without representation." This is one of a myriad of factors which brought about the declaration and the desire for the Americans to actually declare independence and to establish the United States of America as its own independent state, rather than be subjected to the British Empire and the continuation of colonization in this area. The British would be defeated in 1783, and this was with a little bit of help from the French, and the former British colonies would become and form the United States of America. The United States of America would then push further and further to the west in the new frontier and establish and formally colonize the entirety of the Americas as we know it to this day, the United States at least between Canada and Mexico. A further element where we talk about the swing to the east and the motivations for the swing to the east, continuing talking about the economic motivations, was this idea of trade with West Africa. This was not a new phenomenon that had taken place. Trade with West Africa had continued and existed for a very long time. The British had traded with merchants along the west coast of Africa as early as the 1500s. And the main reason for this was to acquire rare minerals and goods. You have, for example, the Gold Coast. The fact that we have the fact that you have a lot of gold being found in places within the west coast of Africa, as well as the Ivory Coast. The idea of there being ivory and ivory poachers which were able to trade these rare goods, which were worth a lot of money. But all of this looks over arguably one of the most important and obviously controversial elements of the British Empire, which was, of course, the greatest trade that they had was in slaves and slavery. The slave trade was, despite the fact that it was outlawed in 1807, it by then was responsible for the exportation of around 3 million Africans to the American colonies to work those colonies in all across the Americas, not just the formal United States of America, but also in South America as well. So the slave trade is a particularly dark element of history, specifically British history. It was outlawed in 1807, but prior to that was one of the most important economic trades between Britain and the Americas and Africa. In the second half of the 1800s, trade was still a major factor when it comes to expansion in Africa, but of course it was no longer trade in slaves, at least for the British. The slavery still existed in the United States, and instead it was trade in other materials, so more gold and ivory and other rare materials. And so as a result of which, as we go into the 1850s, the 1857s, we see that development of more trade routes begin to take place as the British begin to push further and further into the mainland of the African continent. Trade in goods during this second half were more along the lines of materials like gold, iron, and timber. Coal, iron, and timber, rather than gold, ivory, and slaves. And this mainly sought to feed the ever-growing demands of the empire's industrial revolution. Don't forget, the Industrial Revolution would begin in and around the late 1700s, early 1800s. And it would begin in Great Britain, and it would begin as a result of the British Empire. And so to continually fuel the British Empire's Industrial Revolution in the 1850s into the 1890s, that kind of period, there has to have been the growth of and the acquisition of more and more resources, things like coal, things like iron, and things like timber, to be able to feed the ever-growing industrializing state of Great Britain. Interestingly, what would happen in terms of economic factors was a cycle whereby the empire would trade for raw goods in Africa, so i.e. they would purchase and they would get and acquiesce raw goods such as coal, iron and timber from Africa. They would then manufacture them back home into manufactured goods and then sell those goods back to the African states for profit, or back to Africa, the continent, for profit. And so ultimately a cycle of economic development would take place whereby the British would exploit and essentially acquire all of these raw materials and then sell those materials back to them as manufactured goods and take the profits from them as well.